Hey everyone, welcome to SingularityComputers Client Build 8, Part 3. The name of this build is Cytotoxic. At the end of the last video, I installed the finished midplate and blanking plates, and I also started work on another part of the front panel mod. In this video, I'm going to bring the mods close to completion, and I'm also going to get started on the water cooling loops. So I'm now going back to work on the front panel mods, and I'm currently doing a test fit of the panel that I made in the last video with the 3 radiation symbols. And I think you can see now how all of this is going to go together. In front of this is going to be the smoked plexi mod. Behind this will be the 3 Animax TB Apple-ish blue LED fans on the 360mm radiator that's going into the 5.25 inch base. Now, holding this panel into position, I have 2 pieces of angle, and I still need to drill some holes in those, so I have them masked up. I'm just about to mark off those holes. I have plenty of mounting holes here I can use in the sides of the 5.25 inch bays, and it all works out perfectly. This panel is going to sit very closely to the back of the smoked plexi, and the fans are going to sit about 80mm behind this panel, so it's going to give a kind of lens effect. It's going to give it, a bit of depth. That's the aesthetic that I'm going for. And it will also allow for air to come up from the bottom compartment of the case. That's why I have that hole in the midplate at the front there. Now, before I remove this panel to paint it, there is a little problem that I've come across. At the front of the TJ11, there's a unibody frame. There's this inner panel and the outer panel. Dividing them is these 2 plates. There's actually 2 at the bottom as well. And it turns out that this plate is in the way of the plexi, only by a couple of mil. What I'm going to do to fix it is cut this panel off. And the plexi is actually the same width as this panel, so the plexi is going to do its job, but it's going to do its job better, because instead of being a thin dividing panel, it's a massive panel that goes right down the front of the case. So I've removed that corner piece, and I'm now cutting off that vertical panel with a Dremel. And you need to be seriously careful when making a cut like this right up against another panel, because one little gouge into that other panel and there's a lot of cleaning up to do. You'll need to probably file it back, sand it, repaint it, and actually in this case I am going to repaint the panel anyway, just because I don't like having unpainted panels anywhere in my builds, even if they are aluminium and out of sight. I'm now taking off the rest of the high spot with a file. I actually left a fairly large high spot with the Dremel just because I didn't want to damage the panel. It's difficult to file a curved panel. Obviously the file is flat, the panel is curved. It's going to be very easy to get flat spots. You just need to really take your time and keep an eye on the panel. File little bits at a time. I've now sanded it back. I started with a real coarse grit, 80, worked my way back to about 500. I've sprayed it with an etch primer, and I'm now spraying it with top coat. While I was painting the corner panel, I took the opportunity to paint the rest of the panels. These are actually the last of the panels that need to be painted for this build. So the panel with the 3 radiation symbols for the front panel mod, the angle plate to hold it into position, and I've just about finished painting all of these. I just need to do one final coat. So here's the finished corner panel, and you wouldn't even know that I've touched it, and that just comes down to the filing and the sanding. Now I've actually put a bit of a taper on this panel so that the plexi can properly fit. You'll see what I mean once I get it into position, but you can see the taper there. And here's the finished front panel. This is actually going to sit just behind the smoked plexi. I'm really happy with this panel. I've put a lot of time into it. In particular, the finish. I've managed to get this finish on all of the panels that I've painted, and it's very close to the finish on the TJ11. You can see the light texture. The finish on the TJ11 is also lightly textured. It's a powder coat, and getting this finish has taken a lot of time. I also have the angle plate here ready to go. So that's it. All of the painting is now finished for this build. I've just finished test fitting the 360mm radiator into the 5.25 inch bays, and I've come across a little problem. The UN mounts are actually a little bit too long and they infringe on the mounting holes I'm going to use to mount the panel with the 3 radiation symbols. So I'm just going to cut about 10 or 15 millimeters off the end of each of the mounts. So I'm now cutting the ends off the UN mounts with a Dremel, and after this I'll file them, sand them back, clean them up and repaint them. What I'm going to do to increase the strength of this config is mount the radiator sitting down onto the mid plate, because all of the UN mounts are pointing away from the radiator, and this means there's a lot of pressure on the mounts. I'm now going to move on to installing the 360mm radiator onto the mid plate. Now, I had some people comment on the last video. Apparently, if noise blocker E-loop fans are used in a pull configuration, they're noisy. I'm going to test this first, and if there's a problem, I'll swap them around. So I've installed the radiator, and the positioning of it is just perfect. It comes right up to the back of the 5.25 inch bays, which means it's going to be really close to the radiator in the front of the build, which works out perfectly. There's plenty of room at the back of the radiator for the tubing going down and back from the 480mm radiator. Then over the back, there's enough room for all of the cables, SATA, PCI Express power and 24-pin. And you know, it's a great spot for a 360mm radiator in the TJ11. It fills up the blank space from the ducts and 180mm fans perfectly. Basically, there's about 30 to 40mm of space between the bottom of the motherboard and the top of the fans. So there's plenty of room for it. If you wanted to put a thicker radiator or even a push-pull configuration in, it would be possible. Now, there is a problem with the noise blocker E-loop fans in a pull configuration. I didn't have any problems with noise, but I only have to push the blades down 1mm and they're actually scraping on the radiator fins, which is obviously going to make some noise. It doesn't happen on its own, but it would over time. There is a little bit of play in the blades, and that movement is just enough for those fans to hit whatever you mount them to in a pull config. And you know, they're an incredibly silent fan, but it's obviously as soon as they start hitting something, that's where the noise is coming from. That's what people reported. So I am going to reinstall the fans in a push configuration, and I do actually have something in mind for the top of the radiator to improve the aesthetics. Okay, I'm going to come back to the mods and the radiator installations. I'm now testing the graphics cards, ready to install the water blocks onto them. I highly recommend testing components before you install them into a water-cooled build. Obviously, it's going to be a nightmare if one of those components is DOA or faulty. Now, I don't test all of the components, I just test the ones that are going to be extremely difficult to remove. So, the motherboard, the graphics cards, or components that I'm going to be voiding the warranties of if I'm sleeving a power supply, whatever it is. But anyway, I have here 3 MSI GTX 680s. These are the vanilla versions. They run at stock clocks. As you can see, the PCBs are brown, but that's okay because I'm going to be installing backplates onto these graphics cards. I'm now going to install the graphics card water blocks and backplates. Thanks to the removable motherboard tray of the TJ11, I've already installed the motherboard, CPU, memory, also the CPU and motherboard water blocks. And once I've prepared the graphics cards, I'll also install all 3 of them. I like to do as much of the preparation as possible, so I always install all of my water blocks in advance, because when the time comes to install the components, I don't want to have to worry about going back and doing water block installations and things like that. That's the great thing about a removable motherboard tray. It allows you to do even more of the preparation. So here I have the water blocks and backplates. As you can see, the water blocks are the nickel plexi versions. That's one of the things I really like about the TJ11. The graphics card water blocks are a whole lot more visible because the motherboard tray is rotated. But anyway, I'm going to get these installed. The graphics card water blocks are now installed, and I didn't show the installations because I've shown them in every single one of my build logs and a whole lot of other videos. I'm actually going to update my graphics card water block installation guide because it's very old, And I'm going to use one of these installations for the new guide. You can see the backplates are also installed. Very quick and easy installations. I think each one took under 10 minutes, so 30 minutes all up. They could be a whole lot easier though if EK pre-cut all of the thermal pads. Anyway, I now need to get these graphics cards installed onto the motherboard tray and start tubing up the 2 water cooling loops. Okay, the graphics cards are now installed, and this is what I have in mind for the loops so far. I'm definitely going with dual loops. One is going to be for the 3 GTX 680s, the other for the CPU and motherboard water blocks. I'm going to build both loops entirely from acrylic tube. I'm going to use Crystal Link in the shorter sections because it's convenient. There's so many pre-cut lengths, it covers almost every scenario. When I go beyond the length limit of Crystal Link, I have a whole lot of acrylic tube for this build with similar dimensions to Crystal Link. You'll see that in the next part of the build log. The other thing is, I want the loops to look as busy and as complex as possible to fit the theme. But at the same time, this goes without saying, I of course want to maintain maximum performance. The other thing is, because I'm using smaller diameter tubing, I want to find a way of increasing flow. Now, how do you think I can do that? Parallel loops. Now, it's going to give me everything I want for this build. You can see me using an EKFC bridge here, and a lot of what I'm doing here I'm probably going to end up changing. I probably won't end up using this EKFC bridge. The thing is, as I said, I want to go with parallel loops, and because of EK's new graphics card water block design, it really restricts multi-GPU water cooling configs. It's what annoys me about the new design the most. With the old design, you could just go straight through the water blocks and out the other side. So you could use Crystal Link to set up a serial or parallel config, and it looked amazing. What I want for this build is a parallel Crystal Link multi-GPU water cooling config. It would be ideal, but it's just not possible anymore with this new design. The only real way to get a parallel multi-GPU config is with an EKFC bridge. So this is the triple parallel CSQ Plexi version, and I must say, these do look pretty amazing, mainly the transparent version because you can see the coolant flowing through them. They have 3mm LED holes drilled into them so you can light them up nicely. But still, for the theme, I would love to use acrylic tube right through to match up. The only way I can think of, to use Crystal Link for a parallel config for the graphics cards is with T-fittings. Basically two-way fittings, and I think you can probably picture that. The only bits power T-fitting is the big bulky one that sits up really high. There's a Q fitting with the same design, and I think they would look okay, but they're not going to look as clean as an FC bridge. They're going to be very big and bulky, and I'm going to have a think about it. Once I get the motherboard installed and start on the rest of the loop, I'll decide what I am definitely going to do. Now you can see I've built the CPU motherboard loop in serial. I'll probably end up coming back to this and changing it to parallel. I have talked about the benefits of a removable motherboard tray. It means you can do a lot more preparation, have everything ready to go. But when it comes to building the loop, I would prefer to have all of the components installed before I start building the loop, so that I can see the entire picture and build a balanced loop. Basically, get the aesthetics right. But anyway, I'm now going to go back to the mods, and I'm going to complete the front panel. It's actually been about a week now since I last filmed, and in that time I've made some changes to the midplate, and I've had to repaint it, which is what's taken all of the time. Now, what I decided to do, if you remember, originally I had 2 slots cut for cable management, one for the PCIe cables, another for the 24 pin, and I don't think that's going to be enough, so I just decided to cut out the entire section, because I also need to run the 8-pin EPS and 4-pin ATX up to the top right hand corner of the motherboard. And as well as that, I want to run extra power to the DIMM slots and extra power to the PCI Express slots on the Rampage 4 Extreme. And the Rampage 4 has a 4-pin floppy, which I know sounds funny. It's a 4-pin floppy connector for the DIMMs and a 6-pin PCIe for the PCI Express slot. So I need to run those two cables all the way up to the top of the motherboard as well. So because of those extra cables, I thought if I cut out the entire section and have the cables going up next to the radiator, it'll give plenty of room. And it looks a lot better now anyway, not that it's going to be inside or anything. I could have actually, just touched up the panel after cutting it, but it's not the way I do things. There was a few marks, so I thought sand it back, repaint it. In the meantime, I've installed the 360mm radiator into the 5.25 inch bays. As you can see, I have it sitting down onto the midplate. As I mentioned, this is going to give the config a lot more strength, put less pressure on the UN mounts. Over the top of the radiator, you can see I have a good gap for all of the front panel cables. I have also now installed the front panel with the 3 radiation symbols. So in front of this is going to go the front panel smoked plexi mod. And it's a bit of a shame I'm covering up this panel because I put so much effort into it. The finish is going to be invisible behind the smoked plexi. All you're really going to see from it is a silhouette, because behind it, as you can see, is the 3 Enermax TB Appleish fans. And you can see that I've managed to line up the radiation symbols perfectly with the fans, which was not easy because I didn't know exactly where the radiator was going to sit. There's so many holes in the 5.25 inch bays to use. The UN mounts have a bit of movement, so there was a lot of measuring and math involved. Obviously I got it right. If it was even a couple of mil out of line, you'd really notice it, so it was really important that I got those lined up properly. Anyway, it's now time to get this panel covered up with some smoked plexi. So the front panel mods are now complete, and I'm really happy with the way this has turned out. This is exactly what I was going for, what I had in mind. Some of you may think the LEDs aren't bright enough, but actually in normal light they're a little bit too bright. I'm shining a lot of bright white light on this. Those of you that have seen these fans will know how bright they are. What I was going for here, and actually throughout this build, is Cherenkov radiation. It's the blue glow seen underwater in a nuclear reactor, as I've mentioned previously. And it's basically a subtle blue glow. So I think a little bit on the bright side, but it works out perfectly. There's a couple of other things I was going for. I wanted a good distance between the fans and the front panel to create a 3D lens effect, to give it some depth. I also wanted the panel with the 3 radiation symbols to be about 10mm behind the plexi, so that it would cast a small shadow on the back of the plexi. The reason for that is I wanted the silhouette from the radiation symbols softened. I didn't want a hard silhouette because, as I said, I'm going for a subtle, soft blue glow. And the best way to soften it is to give it a bit of distance, let it create the shadow. And I think you can see the soft silhouette, it's from that shadow. So all of that has worked out nicely. So there it is, and that's it for this part of the build log. In the next part of the build log, I'm going to focus on building the loops. That sums up this video. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, like and favorite if you want to see more.